I learned to count in screams before I learned to count in days. That's what the intake supervisor told me when I arrived at Compliance Station Tertius 9, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on my forehead, reading the barcode they'd tattooed there during processing. She didn't smile. Her face had been replaced below the nose with a bronze grill that clicked when she spoke, but I heard something like amusement in the vox-distorted rasp of her voice. "You'll understand soon enough," she said, and I did. I understood within the first shift, when the screaming started at hour 3 and didn't stop until hour 16, a constant backdrop to the rhythm of our work, as regular as the overhead lumens flickering in their cages, as predictable as the taste of recycled air thick with machine oil, and something else, something organic and wrong that coated your tongue and made you gag until you learned not to breathe through your mouth. The station processed compliance violations for 7 hive cities across the sector. That's what they told us. They said we were performing sacred work, that every keystroke we entered into the cogitators was a prayer to the God Emperor's ordered universe, that the sorting and categorization of human failure was itself a form of devotion. I believed it at first. I was 23 standard years old, fresh from the mid-hive scholar, where I'd scored high enough on the administrative aptitude tests to avoid the manufactorums, but not high enough to escape the administratum entirely. I thought I was lucky. I thought processing compliance violations meant reviewing data slates, making corrections in ledgers, perhaps occasionally witnessing a disciplinary hearing. I thought I would sit in a climate-controlled office, my greatest concern whether the recaf dispenser was functioning. The reality was Hab Block 97, a converted cargo section in the station's lower decks where 240 of us lived in tiered bunks that smelled of unwashed bodies and fierce sweat. The reality was the morning klaxon at hour 04, the shuffling line to the hygiene stalls where you had 90 seconds under recycled water that never got warmer than tepid, the protein bars that tasted like compressed fungus and left your mouth feeling coated in chalk. The reality was the march through corridors painted that particular shade of imperial green that exists nowhere in nature, under flickering lumens that hummed at a frequency that made your teeth ache, past doors marked with skulls and high Gothic warnings about unauthorized access and summary execution. The reality was Compliance Hall 7. It was vast, that space. The ceiling disappeared into darkness 40 meters above our heads, supported by columns carved with Gothic script too small to read from the floor. Banks of cogitators stretched in endless rows, each station identical, a desk of worn plasteel, a chair with a thin cushion that did nothing to ease the ache that developed after hour 5, a data slate, a stylus, a pair of brass headphones connected by braided cables to the cogitator's Vox unit. 3,000 stations, 3,000 workers, 3,000 individual hells, all synchronized, all operating according to the same protocols. My station was row 47, position 212. I remember the numbers because I stared at them every day for 6 months before I stopped being able to read them properly, before the characters started sliding around the brass plate like insects. On my first day, I sat down in that chair and felt the cold of the metal through my grey work uniform, felt the weight of the headphones settle over my ears, with a pressure that would become so familiar I'd eventually forget what my head felt like without it. The supervisor, a different one, younger, with both eyes still organic but something dead in them, showed me how to activate the cogitator, how to call up the first file. "You'll review each case," he said, his voice flat, reciting instructions he'd given 10,000 times before. "You'll verify the documentation against the compliance matrices in Appendix 7. You'll classify the violation according to the taxonomies provided. You'll recommend appropriate corrective measures. You'll move to the next case. You will maintain a processing rate of no fewer than 30 cases per hour. You will take your assigned meal break at the designated time. You will not speak to other workers during operational hours. You will not question the content of the files. You will not discuss the cases outside of Compliance Hall 7. Failure to maintain standards will result in corrective action. The Emperor protects. Begin. The first case was a woman from Hive Primus, Stack 44, Hab Unit 700721. Magistra Iseult Ven. She had failed to submit her quarterly tithe documentation by the mandated deadline. The delay, 4 days. The reason, according to her petition, her daughter had died of grey lung, and she'd been required to manage the corpse disposal processing, which had taken 3 days due to backlogs at the crematorium, and then she'd been struck by seasonal influenza and bedridden for 2 days. She included a death certificate for the daughter. She included a medical certification from an authorized physician. She included a letter of apology written in a shaking hand, the desperation bleeding through in the irregular pressure of the stylus marks. I read through the file twice. The matrices were clear, tithe delays of fewer than 7 days, accompanied by documented extenuating circumstances, qualified for a warning and a small fine. I entered the classification code. I recommended the warning. I submitted the file and felt something like relief, like I was helping, like this was the work the God Emperor needed done, maintaining order with mercy where mercy was deserved. The second case was an Underhive gang member accused of unauthorized redistribution of rationed goods. The third was a scribe who'd made an error in a manufacturing report that had resulted in a shipment delay. The fourth was a child, barely 9 standard years old, who'd been caught stealing from a food distribution center. I processed them all according to the matrices, my hands steady on the stylus, my eyes focused on the screen. It was in the second hour that I first heard the screaming. It came through the headphones at first. I'd called up case number 37, a mid-level administratum functionary accused of seditious statements. He'd apparently questioned, in a private conversation that had been reported by a colleague, whether the tithe increases were truly necessary, and when I activated the audio file, expecting to hear testimony or recorded evidence, I heard instead a sound that made every muscle in my body lock rigid. It was a scream, yes, but not just a scream. It was a scream that had gone on so long it had become something else, a sound that had broken through the barrier of what a human throat should be able to produce and emerged on the other side as a kind of wet, gurgling shriek that rose and fell in waves, punctuated by words I couldn't quite make out, pleas that dissolved into incoherence. I yanked the headphones off, my hands were shaking. I looked around expecting to see others reacting, but everyone in my line of sight was hunched over their cogitators, styluses moving, faces blank. The supervisor was walking slowly down row 47, his boots clicking on the metal floor, and when he reached my station he stopped. "Problem, processor?" he asked. "The audio file I managed, there's evidence recorded during compliance review," he said. "You'll need to assess whether appropriate protocols were followed. Return to your work." "But, return to your work." I put the headphones back on. I listened to the entire 17-minute file, my stomach churning, my throat tight. The scream became multiple screams, became begging, became wet sounds and breaking sounds, and finally, toward the end, became silence except for breathing that rattled like stones in a can. When it ended, I sat staring at the cogitator screen, at the question blinking there. Were documented procedures followed? Yes, no. I didn't know what the documented procedures were. I didn't know what I'd just listened to. I clicked yes because I didn't know what else to do, because the supervisor was still walking the rows, because my processing rate had already fallen below standard. That was the first day. By the end of the first week, I'd heard screaming in 64 separate audio files. I'd seen 3 video recordings of what the documentation called enhanced compliance interrogation, though the enhancement seemed to involve instruments I couldn't identify and results that made me vomit into the waste bin beside my station. I'd processed a case involving an entire hive stack, 14,000 people, who'd been reclassified as labor servitors due to a clerical error that had marked them as seditious when they'd simply failed to receive a memo about protocol changes. I'd recommended corrective action that I later realized meant execution for crimes as minor as being late to work 3 times in a month, stealing a half ration of protein paste, or being overheard humming a song that wasn't an approved Imperial hymn. I stopped eating properly. The protein bars tasted like ash. I started having dreams where I was the one in the interrogation chair, where the screams in the headphones were my own screams, echoing back to me through time. I requested a meeting with a supervisor to discuss potential errors in the classification matrices, to question whether some of the recommended actions were proportional to the violations. The request was denied. I submitted it again. It was denied again, this time with a note in my file about concerning ideological patterns. At the end of the first month, they transferred me to row 63, position 409. The cases were different there, not compliance violations anymore, resource allocation disputes. Sounds cleaner, doesn't it? More administrative. But what it meant was that I reviewed petitions from worlds requesting increased food shipments because famine had reduced their populations by 30%, and I compared those petitions against the strategic value assessments in the Imperial databases, and I made recommendations about whether they should receive aid or whether their populations should be allowed to decrease to sustainable levels. What it meant was that I processed reports from Forge worlds requesting additional labor shipments to replace workers who died at rates exceeding replacement capacity, and I calculated how many penal colony populations would need to be converted to servitor stock to meet the demand. I was deciding who lived and who died, and I was doing it 30 times per hour, every hour, for 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The 7th day was supposed to be for rest and religious observance. We were marched to Chapel Block 12, where a preacher with a voice like grinding gears led us through 4 hours of prayer and hymns. The chapel was too small for all of us, so we stood pressed together, the heat of bodies making the air thick and hard to breathe, and we sang about the Emperor's mercy and the glory of sacrifice, while I thought about Magistra Yseult Ven, who'd lost her daughter and then lost her freedom because I'd clicked the wrong box on a form during my first hour of my first day. I'd realized my error that night, lying in my bunk, staring at the metal slats above me. I'd classified her case as a second offense instead of a first. The difference was the difference between a fine and a labor conscription. I'd tried to find the file again to correct it, but the cases moved too fast, were processed too quickly, disappeared into the system like stones into dark water. I told myself it was one mistake, one error, that I'd be more careful, that I'd learn the matrices better, that I'd process the cases more slowly, even if it meant falling below rate standards, that I'd make sure every decision was correct. But the cases kept coming, and the screaming in the audio files kept coming, and by the end of the 2nd month I'd stopped listening carefully to the recordings, because if I listened carefully, I'd hear things that would make me stop working entirely. I'd hear the moment when someone's voice changed from defiant to broken. I'd hear the sounds bodies made when they gave up. I'd hear the wet silence after interrogations concluded. So I played the files and let the sound wash over me without absorbing it, and I clicked the boxes that needed to be clicked, and I maintained my processing rate. The woman at the station next to mine, position 410, was named Keller. She'd been processing compliance violations for 3 years. She was thin in a way that suggested her body was eating itself, her uniform hanging loose on her frame, her eyes sunken deep in her skull. We weren't supposed to talk during operational hours, but sometimes during the meal break she'd sit next to me in the feeding hall and speak in a voice so low I had to lean close to hear. "You stop seeing them as people," she said once, pushing the protein paste around her tray without eating it. "The ones in the files, you stop thinking about them as human. You think about them as cases, as numbers, as problems that need solutions. It's the only way to keep working. If you let yourself think about them, really think about them, you'd go mad. Or you'd refuse to work. And if you refuse to work..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We'd all seen what happened to workers who refused. They'd be removed from the hall by the enforcers in their black carapace armor, and they'd never return. Sometimes their stations would be empty for a day, sometimes for a week. Eventually someone new would sit there, and the work would continue. "How do you do it?" I asked her. 3 years. How do you keep doing it?" She finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. Not madness exactly, something worse. Absence, a hollowness where something human should have been. "You're alive because you haven't broken yet," she said. "That's all. When you break, you stop being alive in any way that matters. But until then, you process the cases. You maintain your rate. You don't think, you survive." I thought about her words during the walk back to Compliance Hall 7, thought about them as I settled into my chair and put on the headphones and called up case number 10263, a farmer from an agri-world who'd failed to meet his crop quota due to a blight that had destroyed 40% of his fields. He was requesting an extension, a reduction in the expected yield for the following season. The matrices were clear. Crop failures due to environmental factors were considered acceptable if they fell within documented parameters. The blight had been reported by the planetary governor 6 months earlier. The farmer's petition was properly formatted, properly submitted. I should have approved the extension. Instead, I rejected it. I classified his failure as willful negligence. I recommended corrective action, seizure of his land holdings, and reassignment to penal labor. I don't know why I did it. My hand moved, clicking the boxes, and I watched it happen like I was outside my own body. When I submitted the file, I felt nothing, just the absence of feeling, just the hollow space where horror should have been. That's when I understood what Keller had meant. Breaking wasn't about refusing to work, it was about becoming something that could do the work without flinching, without questioning, without feeling. It was about turning yourself into a machine that processed human suffering with the same efficiency you'd process inventory reports or shipping manifests. The 3rd month was when I started noticing the changes in the other workers, the way their faces became masks, smooth and blank, the way they moved through the halls like servitors, their gaits mechanical, their eyes focused on nothing, the way they stopped talking during meal breaks, stopped making any sound except the necessary acknowledgments of orders. I started seeing it in the mirrors in the hygiene stalls too, my own face becoming that same mask, my own eyes developing that same absent look. The work became easier, not because the cases were less horrific, they were worse, if anything, escalating in severity as I was promoted through different processing tiers, but because I'd learned to not see them. A child caught stealing food became case number 7821. Classification, property theft, minor, recommendation, corrective labor assignment, duration, indeterminate. A woman who'd spoken against the sector governor became case number 7822, classification, sedition, verbal recommendation, enhanced interrogation followed by execution. An entire settlement that had failed to meet tithe requirements for 3 consecutive quarters became case number 7823. Classification, systematic compliance failure, recommendation, population reduction to sustainable levels. The screaming in the audio files became background noise. The images in the video recordings became abstract patterns of flesh and metal and blood. The petitions and pleas became meaningless text to be scanned for keywords that would determine classification. I was promoted to senior processor at the start of the 4th month. The promotion came with a private cubicle, still small, still cold, but with actual walls instead of just a station in an open hall, and an increase in food rations, and cases that required what they called judgment level assessment. These were the cases where the matrices didn't provide clear guidance, where I was expected to interpret imperial law and determine appropriate responses based on my understanding of proper compliance standards. My first judgment-level case was a tech priest from a forge world who'd been accused of heretical innovation. He designed a modification to a manufacturing assembly system that increased efficiency by 12%. The modification hadn't been approved by the proper authorities. It hadn't followed the sacred patterns. It was, according to the accusation, a deviation from the machine god's ordained designs. The tech priest argued that the modification was based on rediscovered STC fragments, that it was actually a return to older, purer designs. He included technical documentation. He included testimony from other tech priests supporting his interpretation. I read through the file 3 times. The evidence suggested he was correct, that his modification was indeed based on valid ancient technology. The efficiency gains were significant. The deviation from protocol was minor and motivated by genuine faith rather than heretical intent. I recommended his execution and the destruction of all related documentation. I submitted the file and moved to the next case without pausing, without thinking, without feeling. That night, lying in my bunk, I tried to remember why I'd made that recommendation. I couldn't. The reasoning, if there had been any reasoning, was gone. All I could remember was the rhythm of my hand moving, clicking the appropriate boxes, following the path of least resistance through the decision tree. Deviation required correction, correction required severity, severity required finality. The logic was perfect, the logic was imperial, the logic was the machine I'd become. Keller stopped coming to the feeding hall. Her station in row 63 was empty for 3 days, then filled by someone new. I didn't ask what had happened to her. I already knew. She'd broken in a different way than I had. She'd broken into pieces instead of breaking into smoothness. Same result though, removal, replacement, continuation of the work. The 5th month was when I started hearing the screaming when I wasn't wearing the headphones. It would start during the meal breaks, a distant sound that seemed to come from the ventilation shafts, though when I tried to focus on it, I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was memory, audio files replaying in my mind without permission. It would continue in the sleeping hours, seeping through the walls of Hab Block 97, a constant background chorus that no one else seemed to notice, or if they noticed, no one acknowledged. I asked the Hab Block supervisor if there were interrogation cells nearby. He looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give to someone who'd asked an obscene question. Compliance stations operate on a need-to-know basis processor, he said. You need to know how to classify cases and recommend actions. You don't need to know facility layout. Return to your bunk. But I knew the screaming was real. I knew it was close. I knew that somewhere in this station, probably just meters away from where we slept and ate and processed our cases, people were being subjected to the corrective actions we recommended. People were living through or dying through the consequences of my 30 clicks per hour, every hour, 16 hours a day. The knowing should have horrified me. It didn't. It was just information. Just another data point to be filed away in the growing archive of things I understood but didn't feel. The 6th month was when they started the efficiency improvement program. New quotas, 40 cases per hour instead of 30. New quality metrics, no more than 1 appeal per 1,000 cases processed. New performance standards, processors who fell below target rates for more than 2 consecutive shifts would be subject to review. The review process was never explained. Processors would be called away during operational hours. They wouldn't return. Their stations would be filled. I met the new quotas, I exceeded them, I processed 45 cases per hour, sometimes 50. I became the model processor, the one supervisors would point to during training sessions for new workers. I received commendations, I received additional ration increases, I received a badge that I was supposed to wear on my uniform, a small brass thing stamped with the administratum's seal, and a number indicating my performance tier. I wore the badge. I ate the extra rations. I processed the cases. A man who'd failed to report a neighbor's suspicious behavior. A woman who'd been caught with unauthorized literature. A child who'd been born with a mutation so minor it was barely visible, but which still qualified as abhuman deviance. A priest who'd interpreted scripture in a way that contradicted official doctrine. A soldier who'd retreated from a battle he'd been ordered to fight to the death. A worker who'd fallen asleep during a shift due to exhaustion. A family who'd tried to emigrate from their hive city without proper authorization. 45 times per hour, 720 times per shift, 4,320 times per week. Each case took approximately 80 seconds, 70 seconds to review the file, identify the relevant matrices, determine classification, 10 seconds to enter the recommendation and submit. Next case. And again, and again. The rhythm became meditation. The work became prayer. Every click of the stylus was an affirmation of imperial order. Every submission was an offering to the God Emperor's perfect bureaucracy. I stopped dreaming, or rather, I dreamed only of the cases. I'd sleep and see files scrolling past, endless streams of names and accusations and pleas, and I'd process them in my dreams with the same efficiency I processed them while awake. I'd wake up exhausted, my hands cramping as if I'd been gripping a stylus all night. The screaming got louder, or I got better at hearing it. During operational hours it would seep through the walls of my cubicle, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the metal floor, in the desk, in my bones. I learned to ignore it the same way I'd learned to ignore everything else. It was just sound. Just vibrations in air, just the normal operating noise of a compliance station. The 7th month was when I was called to processing oversight for what they termed a performance optimization consultation. The office was 3 levels above Compliance Hall 7, in a section of the station I'd never visited. The corridors there were different, cleaner, better lit, with actual decorations on the walls instead of just warning signs and imperial eagles. The people who walked those corridors wore better uniforms, moved with more confidence, looked at me like I was something they'd scraped off their boots. The optimization consultant was a woman who might have been 40 or might have been 60, her age obscured by augmetics that had replaced most of her skull with polished chrome. Cables ran from her head to a massive cogitator bank that took up an entire wall of her office. When she spoke, her voice came from a vox unit in her throat, perfectly modulated and completely inhuman. "Processor designate 77492, she said, and I realized with a distant surprise that I'd stopped thinking of myself by my name months ago. "Your performance metrics are exemplary. Accuracy rating 99.3%. Processing rate 147% of standard. Appeal rate 0.002%. You represent the ideal toward which all processors should strive." Though I wasn't sure if gratitude was the appropriate response. "However," she continued, "your biometric readings indicate degrading psychological coherence, sleep disruption, appetite inconsistency, elevated stress markers. These factors, if left unaddressed, could eventually impact processing efficiency." "I'm meeting all quotas," I said, "currently, but predictive modeling suggests decline within 3 to 6 months. We cannot afford to lose high-performing processors. Therefore, we're offering you an optimization upgrade." She turned to gesture at the cogitator bank, and I saw an image appear on one of the screens. A human brain, sectioned and labeled. Then the same brain with additions, metallic structures interfacing with neural tissue, cables running from organic to synthetic, processors embedded in gray matter. Standard cognitive augmentation package, she said, increases processing capacity by 40%, eliminates emotional disruption, maintains core decision-making capacity while removing psychological barriers to optimal performance. The procedure is routine, recovery time is minimal. Upgrades like this are common among senior processors. I stared at the image, at the brain that was partly machine, at the solution to my degrading performance metrics. Is it mandatory? I asked. No, but processors who decline optimization are typically reassigned to lower-tier duties. Your performance would be wasted on basic classification work. And the alternative progression path is less favorable. She didn't specify what that meant. She didn't need to. I'd processed enough cases to know what happened to workers whose performance declined, what happened to people the administratum no longer considered useful. How long do I have to decide? I asked. The procedure is scheduled for tomorrow at 0800. Report to Medicaid Block 4. Failure to report will be considered a declination. I was dismissed. I walked back through those clean corridors down to the levels where I belonged. Back to Compliance Hall 7. I sat at my station in my cubicle and put on the headphones and processed cases for the remaining 11 hours of my shift, and the entire time I thought about that image, the brain with its metal additions, the organic tissue interfaced with synthetic processors, the solution, the next stage of breaking. That night I didn't return to Hab Block 97. I don't know why. The decision to walk past the Hab Block entrance to continue down the corridor towards sections of the station I'd never explored wasn't really a decision. It was just movement, just feet carrying me somewhere my processed mind hadn't approved. I walked for what might have been an hour, following the screaming that was now loud enough that I knew it couldn't be imagination. The corridors in this section were older, less maintained. The lumens flickered more. The air tasted wrong, thick with something chemical and organic at once. Warning signs covered the walls, authorized personnel only, compliance enforcement in progress. Imperial authority supersedes all local protocols. I found the door because I followed the sound to its source. It was blast-reinforced plasteel, marked with purity seals and pict screens showing the interior. I should have turned away. I should have returned to the Hab block. I should have reported myself for unauthorized access. Instead, I looked at the screens. The room beyond was enormous, the size of Compliance Hall 7, but arranged differently. Not rows of cogitator stations, rows of chairs, metal chairs with restraints, occupied chairs, hundreds of them. People strapped down, their heads immobilized, their bodies held rigid. Tech priests moving between the rows with instruments I recognized from the video files I'd processed. Medicaid servitors administering injections, applying electrodes, making adjustments to equipment I couldn't identify. And everywhere, on every screen, the same scene repeating, a person restrained, a person being worked on, a person screaming or having already screamed themselves into silence. I watched for I don't know how long. Long enough to understand what I was seeing. This was where the recommendations went. This was where enhanced interrogation and corrective processing and compliance adjustment actually happened. This was the machinery behind the euphemisms, and I understood looking at those screens that every person in those chairs was there because someone like me had clicked a box, had classified their case, had recommended action, had moved on to the next file in the endless queue. I thought I should feel horror. I thought I should feel guilt or grief or rage or something human. But all I felt was the same hollow absence I'd been feeling for months. These were just the cases, just the numbers, just the logical outcome of the work we did. One of the screens showed a close-up of a woman's face, She was younger than me, maybe 19, 20 standard years. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks, her mouth open in a scream I could hear even through the reinforced door. And as I watched, a tech priest approached her with something that looked like a drill, and I turned away. I walked back through the corridors, back to Hab Block 97, back to my bunk. I lay there until the klaxon sounded at 0400, and then I stood and moved through the morning routine with the same mechanical precision I developed over 6 months. At 0800, I reported to Medicaid Block 4. The procedure room was cold and bright, all white tile and steel surfaces that reflected the overhead lumens until the light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They had me change into a thin medical gown that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt since my first day at the station. A Medicaid with augmetic eyes that clicked when they focused examined me briefly, checking readouts on a data slate, making notations I couldn't read. "Standard cognitive optimization," he said, not looking at me. "You'll be conscious throughout. The procedure takes approximately 4 hours. Discomfort is minimal. Cognitive disruption during integration is normal. Most patients return to full processing capacity within 2 days. Questions?" I had thousands of questions. I asked none of them. They positioned me in a chair that was too similar to the chairs I'd seen on the pic screens, though this one was cleaner, more medical, less overtly threatening. Restraints locked around my wrists and ankles for stability during the procedure to prevent involuntary movement, and a frame descended over my head, holding it immobile. I could see the ceiling above me, white tile marked with brown stains that might have been rust or might have been something else. The drilling started without warning. I felt pressure first, then a sensation like someone pushing a stylus into my skull, then pain that was sharp and immediate, and then suddenly gone. They'd injected something. "Local anesthetic," the Medicaid said. "I wouldn't feel pain, just pressure, just the sense of intrusion." I felt the drill go deeper, felt something shift inside my head. Felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through my thoughts like static on a Vox channel. "Initializing interface," someone said. And then I felt them, the processors, the augmetics, foreign objects sliding into my brain, interfacing with neural tissue, connecting synapses to circuits. It didn't hurt exactly, but it felt wrong in a way that went deeper than pain. It felt like violation, like something essential was being changed without my permission, even though I'd agreed to this, even though I'd reported for the procedure. I wanted to scream, I wanted to tear the restraints off and run, but my body wouldn't obey. The commands from my brain to my muscles were being filtered through the new hardware, and the hardware was still calibrating, still learning, still integrating. "Cognitive baseline stable," a voice said, "proceeding with deep integration." The static in my thoughts grew louder. I started seeing things that weren't there, streams of data overlaying my vision, case files appearing unbidden in my memory, processing matrices arranging themselves in precise geometric patterns inside my mind. The augmetics were connecting to my existing neural pathways, mapping themselves to my thought processes, learning how I processed information so they could optimize the process. I felt something slip away, some part of myself becoming inaccessible, partitioned behind new architecture I hadn't chosen. I tried to hold on to it, tried to remember what it felt like to feel horror at the cases, to question the recommendations, to see the people in the files as human, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. It flowed away, it disappeared into the gaps the augmetics created. Integration complete, initializing optimization protocols, and then I felt it begin. The optimization, the removal of barriers, the streamlining of decision-making processes. The augmetics identified thought patterns that slowed processing, moral consideration, emotional response, uncertainty, doubt, and they smoothed them away. They didn't remove my ability to think. They just removed my ability to think in ways that weren't efficient. They left me with the capacity to classify and recommend and process, and they took away everything that might interfere with those functions. I felt myself breaking in a way I'd been slowly breaking for 6 months, but this was faster, more complete, more final. This was breaking as optimization, breaking as improvement, breaking as the solution to the problem of being human while doing inhuman work. The procedure ended. They released the restraints. I stood on legs that felt strange, walked on feet that seemed disconnected from my body. Everything felt distant, filtered through layers of processing I couldn't quite access. I returned to my cubicle in Compliance Hall 7. I sat down at my station. I put on the headphones. I called up the first case. The processing was different now. Faster. Cleaner. I didn't need to read through the entire file. The augmetics analyzed it as my eyes scanned the text, extracting relevant information, cross-referencing matrices, generating recommendations before my conscious mind had finished parsing the words. Where I'd processed 45 cases per hour before, I now processed 60, 70, 80. The numbers climbed. The cases flowed. The work became automatic in a way it had never been before, even at my most efficient. My hands moved without conscious direction. My eyes tracked across screens, following patterns the augmetics had identified as optimal. My brain generated classifications and recommendations with mechanical precision. I was aware, in some distant way, that I should be disturbed by this, that the loss of control should frighten me, but the capacity for fear had been optimized away. I felt only satisfaction at the increasing efficiency, only pleasure at exceeding quotas, only contentment in the perfect execution of my function. The screaming in the walls didn't bother me anymore. It was just audio data, just another input to be processed and filed away. The faces in the case files didn't haunt me. They were just visual information, just features to be catalogued in the endless database of violations and corrections. The pleas and petitions didn't move me. They were just text to be analyzed for procedural compliance. I was perfect. I was optimal. I was exactly what the administratum needed me to be. The months that followed are difficult to reconstruct in sequence. The augmetics changed how I experience time. Instead of flowing linearly, it became segmented into processing blocks, shift blocks where I processed cases, maintenance blocks where I recharged and consumed nutrients, rest blocks where my organic components recovered, while the synthetic components continued low-level operations. The distinction between one day and another blurred. All that mattered was the work. I was promoted again. Senior Processing Supervisor. I received my own office, larger than the cubicle, with actual furniture and a window that looked out onto the station's interior docking bay. I could see ships coming and going, cargo vessels and prison transports and administratum courier craft. I watched them while I processed cases, the work continuing without interruption even as I observed the ships, my augmetics allowing me to split attention between multiple input streams. My duties expanded beyond just processing individual cases. Now I reviewed the work of other processors, identifying inefficiencies, recommending optimizations. I had authorization to mandate augmetic upgrades for underperforming workers. I scheduled the procedures personally, selecting candidates based on performance metrics and psychological degradation indicators. I sent 47 processors for optimization in my first month as supervisor. I felt satisfaction each time, knowing I was improving overall efficiency, knowing I was helping them become what they needed to be. The station commander visited my office once. I'd never seen him before. He was several levels above me in the hierarchy, but apparently my performance metrics had attracted attention. He was old, augmented so extensively that it was difficult to tell where organic tissue ended and mechanical components began. One eye was human. The other was a multi-spectrum scanner that clicked and whirred as it examined me. Exemplary work, supervisor, he said, his voice emerging from a Vox unit embedded in his chest. Your processing efficiency has increased overall station output by 12%. Your optimization recommendation accuracy is perfect. You represent the ideal synthesis of human judgment and mechanical precision. Thank you, Commander, I said. The words came automatically, generated by social protocol subroutines in the augmetics. I'm authorizing an expansion of your duties. You'll now oversee 3 compliance halls instead of 1. Your processing staff will increase to 9,000. Your optimization authority is expanded to include mandatory upgrades based solely on predictive modeling. You won't need to wait for performance decline before recommending augmentation. Understood, Commander. The administrator needs more like you, he said, and I detected something in his organic eye, something that might have been approval or might have been pity or might have been nothing, just a flicker of moisture in aging tissue. The work you do maintains the Imperium. Every case you process, every violation you classify, every correction you recommend, it's all part of the God Emperor's great machine. You should be proud. I am functioning at optimal capacity, I said, because pride was an emotion and emotions had been optimized away. He left. I returned to work. The cases continued. 9,000 processors now fell under my supervision. I reviewed their performance metrics daily, identifying patterns of decline, projecting future failures, scheduling preemptive optimizations. The augmentation rate increased. Within 6 months, 70% of my staff had received at least basic cognitive upgrades. Within a year, 90%. The ones who declined the procedures were transferred. Their performance inevitably declined. They broke in the messy way, the way Keller had broken, becoming unable to process the work, unable to maintain the emotional distance necessary for efficiency. I classified their cases personally. I recommended their corrections. I moved on to the next file. The station processed compliance violations for 7 hive cities across the sector. That's what they'd told me on my first day, but that number had grown. Now it was 12 cities, 15, 20. The Imperium's reach was expanding, or its standards were tightening, or its populations were becoming less compliant. The reasons didn't matter, only the work mattered, only the processing. I sat in my office and watched the numbers climb. Cases processed per day, 3 million. Cases pending processing, 8 million. Backlog growth rate 4% per week. Projected optimization requirements 6,000 additional processors per quarter. Projected augmentation requirements total, complete, absolute. Within 5 years at current rates, every processor in every compliance station in the sector would be augmented. Within 10 years, the augmentation would spread to other sectors. Within 20, the entire administrator and processing division would be more machine than human. Billions of processors interfaced with cogitators, all working in perfect synchronization, processing cases with absolute efficiency. The thought should have horrified me. Once it would have. Now it just seemed logical, optimal, inevitable. I worked 16-hour shifts every day without breaks. The augmetics didn't require rest the way organic brains did. I could process continuously, maintaining focus and accuracy indefinitely. I consumed nutrient paste during brief interruptions, but I didn't need meal breaks. I didn't need sleep, just periodic rest blocks where I'd sit motionless while my organic components recovered. The screaming in the walls had stopped bothering me months ago. Now I barely registered it. It was just ambient noise, like the hum of the ventilation systems or the clicking of the cogitators. My audio processing filters had learned to categorize it as irrelevant data and suppress it. Sometimes, during the rest blocks, fragments of memory would surface. Unoptimized memories from before the augmentation. I'd remember sitting in my bunk in Hab Block 97 feeling horror at the cases. I'd remember Keller's hollow eyes. I'd remember the woman on the pict screen, her face frozen in a scream. I'd remember the person I'd been, who'd believed this was important work, who'd wanted to help maintain imperial order with mercy where mercy was deserved. The memories felt alien, like they belonged to someone else, someone inefficient and compromised and broken in all the wrong ways. The augmetics would flag these memories as processing anomalies, would suppress them, would return my consciousness to the work. I'd call up the next case file, I'd process it in 0.73 seconds. I'd move to the next. A woman who'd hoarded food during a famine, a man who'd questioned a tithe assessment, a child who'd drawn a picture of the emperor that didn't match approved iconography, a tech priest who'd performed maintenance on a sacred machine without proper prayers, a soldier who'd survived when his unit had been ordered to fight to the death, a worker who'd been late to his shift due to illness. Each case took less than a second. Classification, recommendation, submission, next. The work was perfect, the system was perfect, the Imperium was perfect, I was perfect. The station commander called me to his office again 2 years after my promotion to supervisor. My third augmentation had just been completed, deep neural integration, that increased processing capacity by another 60% and added predictive modeling capabilities that allowed me to anticipate violations before they occurred. I was processing 800 cases per hour now. My staff, fully optimized, was processing 12 million cases per day. Supervisor 77492, he said, and I realized I'd completely forgotten my name. It was gone, optimized away as irrelevant information. I was my designation now, that was all I needed to be. Yes, Commander. Your success has attracted attention at sector level. The Administratum is implementing your optimization protocols across all compliance stations in the segmentum. Your methodology will become standard. Within a decade, every processor in Imperial service will be augmented according to your model. Efficiency will increase significantly, I said, because that was the appropriate response. Yes, but there's a concern. He paused, his mechanical eye clicking as it focused on my face. The augmentation process is effective, too effective. Processes become optimal, but they lose something in the process. The ability to exercise true judgment in edge cases, the capacity for creative interpretation of complex situations, the human element that makes discretionary decisions possible. Judgment subroutines can be enhanced, I said. Creative processing algorithms can be implemented. Human elements are inefficiencies that can be optimized. Perhaps. But the Administratum needs both. Perfect efficiency for standard cases and human judgment for exceptional situations. You represent the transition point. You retain enough organic cognitive capacity to exercise discretion, but you've been optimized enough to process with perfect efficiency. You're the model, but you're also the warning. I don't understand, Commander. No, he said. And this time I definitely saw something in his organic eye. Something like regret. You wouldn't. That's the problem. The next generation of processors will be optimized beyond your level. They'll be pure efficiency, they'll process cases perfectly, but they'll never question whether the matrices themselves are correct. They'll never recognize when exceptions need to be made. They'll never understand that the Imperium, for all its flaws, requires some measure of human judgment to function. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the docking bay. I approved your optimization program because it worked, he continued, because efficiency increased, because backlogs decreased, because the work got done. But I'm old enough to remember when processors were human. When they made mistakes, yes, but when they also exercised mercy. When they could look at a case and see the person behind it and make a decision that served the Imperium's interests, but also acknowledged that person's humanity. Mercy is inefficient, I said, and I meant it. The augmetics had run the calculations. Mercy slowed processing. Mercy introduced variability. Mercy was a weakness. Yes, he said, it is. But mercy is also what separates us from the machines we're becoming. And when we lose that completely, when every processor in the Imperium is optimized to your level and beyond, we'll be efficient, we'll be perfect, but we'll no longer be human in any meaningful sense. We'll be servitors with delusions of consciousness. He turned back to me. I'm not stopping the program. The numbers don't allow for that. But I want you to understand what you've built, what you're becoming, what we're all becoming. I understand efficiency, I said. I understand optimal processing. I understand the requirements of the Imperium. I know. That's why you're perfect for this work, and that's why you're already lost. He dismissed me. I returned to my office. I processed cases for the remaining 12 hours of my shift without pause, without thought, without any understanding of what he'd been trying to tell me. 3 months later, I received my 4th augmentation, then my 5th, then my 6th. Each upgrade increased capacity. Each upgrade removed more organic limitations. Each upgrade brought me closer to the perfect synthesis of human and machine the administratum required. The person I'd been, the one who'd arrived at Compliance Station Tertius 9 with hopes and fears and the capacity for horror, was gone. Optimized away, replaced with something more efficient. I tell myself I don't mourn that person. Mourning would be inefficient. But sometimes, in the microsecond gaps between case processing, I catch fragments of sensation that the augmetics can't quite suppress, the memory of what it felt like to care, the ghost of emotional response, the phantom echo of humanity. These fragments are classified as processing errors. They're suppressed automatically. They don't interfere with the work. I process cases at 974 per hour now. My staff processes 15 million per day. The backlog is finally shrinking. The system is working. The Imperium is more efficiently ordered than ever before. I sit in my office, the one with the window overlooking the docking bay, and I watch ships arrive and depart, and I process cases, and I send processors for optimization, and I recommend corrections for violations, and I maintain the perfect machinery of imperial compliance. The screaming in the walls has become so normalized I no longer categorize it as sound. It's just vibrations. Just air pressure changes, just data. I'm told I'll receive my 7th augmentation soon. This one will replace most of my remaining organic neural tissue with synthetic processors. After this upgrade, I'll be less than 20% biological. The distinction between human and machine will become academic. I'll be a processor in the most literal sense, a component in the administratum's vast cogitator network. I should have feelings about this once I would have. Now I just see it as the logical conclusion. The final optimization. The complete removal of all inefficiencies. I'll continue to process cases. I'll continue to maintain efficiency. I'll continue to serve the Imperium as I was always meant to serve it, perfectly, without question, without hesitation, without mercy. The station commander was right. I am the model. I am the warning. I am what every processor will become. I am alive because I haven't broken yet. But the truth is, I broke 6 years ago, in my first week at Compliance Station Tertius 9. I just didn't realize it. I thought breaking meant refusing to work, meant collapsing under the horror, meant ending up like Keller. I was wrong. Breaking meant becoming something that could do the work without flinching. Breaking meant optimizing yourself or being optimized into a thing that could process human suffering with perfect efficiency. Breaking meant replacing your humanity with machinery, piece by piece, choice by choice, case by case, until there was nothing left but the work. I am alive because I haven't broken yet, but I broke long ago. And I continue to break every day, every hour, every case, 974 times per hour. 15 million times per day, in the endless processing of imperial compliance. The God Emperor protects, the system functions, the work continues. And I continue, a ghost in a machine that used to be human, processing the endless tide of violations and corrections and cases, maintaining the perfect machinery of oppression that is the Imperium of man. This is my confession, this is my testimony, this is what I have become. I am processor designate 77492. I had a name once. I can't remember it. I was human once. I can't remember that either. I am alive because I haven't broken yet. The lie sustains me. The work continues, always.